Hi and welcome everyone again to the fourth and the last Sweden VMUG of 2021. Thanks for joining and be with us during this year. And a special thanks to the sponsors of the event because they are not only generous to share their knowledge with us, but also offer prizes. Yeah, you heard correctly. We are going to play a Kahoot game at the end of the event, and a quiz is going to launch, and the question is going to be from the content of the sessions. And the first three top participants who answer the most questions correctly and register themselves on the landing page that Just Sharuz posted on the chat box of the Rubric and Commvault, both. You need to register yourself on both landing page. Then you have a chance to win the prizes. We're going to share the code of Kahoot game later on in the chat box, so don't worry on that. So bear with us and listen carefully. Yes. If you want to add something, Sharuz.
Yeah, so I just want to mention something because I have asked from one of the sponsors, organizers. So the Atia has mentioned that I need to address that Atia not going to give any prizes. And anyone who joined from Atia Sweden technically not allowed to just participate, unfortunately, in the draw of the prizes. So that's what I needed to say, as I am also part of Atia Sweden. So just make that in mind. And the compliance department asked me to just mention that Atia is a sponsor, but not gonna do any prize giveaway. As also Sadaf mentioned, please make sure you register yourself on the landing page of Rubric and also Commvault, which I posted. And we're gonna run a Kahoot game at the end. So just pay it close attention because the question's gonna come out of the session contents. Thank you, Sadaf.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, thanks for emphasizing this again, because it's important to know, like, a lot of people unfortunately can't be participate in the game. But for those of you who don't know the VMUG leadership team, we're going to introduce ourselves. My name is Sadaf Allahiri. I'm a senior consultant working at Atea. My main specialty is on VMware. I'm also a co-blogger and a co-video content developer at VLMs.net. And last but not least, I'm honored to be part of VMUG Sweden leadership team. Sharuz, please go ahead and introduce yourself.
All right, thank you, Sadaf. My name is Sharuz Laiji. I'm also part of the Sweden VMUG leadership team. I'm working as a solutions architect at Atea. I am a dual VCIX on data center virtualization and network virtualization, and I'm mainly helping customers here, not only in Sweden, but around the Nordics to build up software-defined data centers and also hybrid cloud environments. We also have the third VMUG leader, which is not with us, Jasper Franzen. Jasper is also working as a system engineer, and he's also a V expert. Back to you, Sadaf.
Thank you. Regarding today's agenda, the first session is going to start shortly at 13:15, and Pierre will talk about how to build a data security fortress for your VMware workloads with Rubric. And then we are going to have a time for your questions and, importantly, a Swedish fika. Then the second session will start at 14:15. And Roger and Mark are going to talk about business continuity for the software-defined era. Again, we're going to have time for a Q&A and a short break. And the last session will start at 15:15. Dheeraj and Sharuz will talk about Azure VMware solutions, networking and business continuity, and disaster recovery. And at the end, at 16, we are going to play the Kahoot game. So for your information, I don't know if you have realized it yet or not, but we're going to record this session and you can find it on VLMs.net YouTube channel. Thanks for listening to me, and to you, Pierre.
Thank you both. Let me just set my Zoom window Good afternoon, I guess, maybe good morning for some of you. My name is Pierre-François Guglielmi, and actually I'm going to share my screen right now so that you can see what I want to present. And I am an Alliances Field CTO at Rubric for the EMEA region. I've been with Rubric for 3.5 years now. I've been in the virtualization space for quite some time because this is where I come from. I think I started virtualization in production in 2005, I guess. It was with ESX 2.5. It was a long time ago. And actually, shortly after that, I joined a VMware distributor and training center too in France, because I'm based in France. And so I was a VMware trainer for a few years. So yeah, I come from virtualization with VMware, so I'm quite familiar with that. Although, you know, I wouldn't say to that I am an expert such as Chorus, for example, or Setup, but yeah, I'm quite familiar with all that. So what I want to tell you today is how Rubric can help your customers, or maybe yourselves if you work for end users and customers, to really build an environment, a platform that will make sure that, you know, in case of a cyber attack, you will be able to recover. So a lot of content, a lot of things to cover. I hope I'll be able to show you a few things too, but let's dive right in. So just to start with just some context, because, you know, we're talking about ransomware, it's not new, right? And it didn't come with the COVID pandemic, but actually the pandemic also accelerated ransomware attacks and ransomware opportunities. So that's why I'm saying here that it's kind of a double pandemic. There is the obvious COVID-19 pandemic, and there's this one, which is very unfortunate, but it's the truth. Now, what's important, I think, to highlight here is not only the fact that we have seen that acceleration in ransomware attacks and cyber criminality, but it's also the fact that ransomware is also evolving, and it's actually constantly evolving. And one thing that I think is worthwhile highlighting here is this one. So I'm sure, you know, we all hear about stories, bad stories of attacks every single week, unfortunately. But this one, I think, is quite interesting. And not only because it's a Swedish company. Actually, it was not done on purpose, by the way. That's something that I use quite regularly. But it's an interesting one from a ransomware evolution perspective. You know, usually when cyber criminals target an organization, it's like an individual organization, and they try to find some vulnerabilities or to use phishing, for example, whatever it may be. But here in that case, in the case of Coop, what they did is that they infected one of the softwares that this company was using, and this company was just one customer of that software, and I'm talking about Cassia here. And so what they did is that they infected the Cassia software, which was, of course, distributed and deployed within, you know, multiple different organizations' environments. And so that means that instead of targeting one single organization, they were able to actually attack at the same time with the same means, multiple organizations at the same time. In the case of Coop, unfortunately, they had to shut down 500 of their 800 stores. And it really disrupted their business. But that's really a new way of doing things. And actually, I will get back to the evolution of ransomware because it also changes the way that victims must respond. So when you think about protecting the data, because when any organization is attacked, they will have at some point to try at least and recover from their backup. And so when you think about like regular backup and the way that we did it, or that we've done it for like 30 years or so, you know, backup was seen as something very complicated and time consuming and not always very reliable. And it was something like an insurance that organization had to do, but it was painful. And this has changed with the acceleration of ransomware. Backup now is top of mind for pretty much everybody because of that. So that means that it's a priority now. There are more budgets for that as well, to reinforce and strengthen the responses and the remediation plans against ransomware attacks. And so there's that quote that I think is interesting because it's not a backup vendor that says it. It's actually a security vendor that says it. So it's really different. But the context is the same, it's ransomware. And they say, and actually I can tell you who that is, it's Palo Alto Networks. And they say, the CIO of Palo Alto Networks says, the main reason to look at backup now is ransomware. And I think that's the truth, actually. And they also say that thick walls are not enough. What do they mean by that? It means that normally a good approach to data security or to security in general is a multi-layered approach. Right? So we know that there are multiple layers, but what that means is that all of these layers, all these solutions that have been implemented over the years are unfortunately not enough because we know that attacks get through sometimes. So if you think about a business and an IT environment, of course, I think because of the acceleration of digital transformation too, everything is now digital. Everything is about data. So there are multiple different types of applications, whether on premises or in the cloud, or whether they are, in the form of SaaS application. I'm thinking about Microsoft 365 here specifically because, the adoption has drastically accelerated too, or the likes of Salesforce or, you name it. All of these applications serve a purpose for the business of a given organization. And all of these applications generate data that supposedly is protected, is backed up. Okay. Like I said, there are multiple different layers of security that have been implemented: perimeter, network, endpoint, application, different kind of things. But the reality, like I said, is that some attacks still get through. Sometimes it's because of phishing. And when you have a tired user that opens up the wrong email or opens up the wrong attachment, there's not much that you can do against that, right? So attacks get through, and sometimes it's just because they exploit vulnerabilities that are 0-day. And actually 74% of attacks today are exploiting 0 days. So when they get through, when they get in, what they target is the most critical asset of any organization today, which is the data. So when something hits, when a ransomware attack hits, what happens? What are the options here? Well, one of them could be just to pay the ransom, get the tools, get the decryption key, and try to unlock the data that has been held hostage. Not recommended, and of course there are multiple reasons for that. One of them is that when a victim pays the ransom, there is absolutely no guarantee that the attackers will provide the right tools, that they will provide the decryption keys, and if they do, there's no guarantee that they will work. And the other thing that shouldn't be overlooked is that if an organization, if a victim pays the ransom, it sends a signal to the cyber criminals that that organization was able to pay. They did it once. Why wouldn't they do it a second time? So they will manage, or they will arrange to make sure that they can attack a second time. So that's a bad thing to do. People should try to avoid paying the ransom. So the other option is what? Is try to recover, right? We have backups. We're supposed to back up everything. Let's try to recover. So let's engage the admins, backup admins, those the IT teams on one hand. But on the other hand, we're talking about a cyber attack. So we need to engage the security ops teams because actually they will have to isolate, identify, where the attack came from, how it managed to get in, and maybe identify patient zero and find the original vulnerability, for example, and try to fix this. But the IT teams will have to try and recover. And so they will get to the backup systems and do what they have to do. But the thing is, like I said, we have, and maybe I haven't said that, but we have approximately 2/3, 70% of ransomware attacks today that target backup environments and data as not exactly the first step, but almost. And unfortunately, there are a lot of solutions on the marketplace that are either vulnerable or that expose the data, the backup data, on the network. And we know that ransomware attacks also try to see over the network what can be reached and what can be impacted or infected. So sometimes, it just doesn't work because the backup environment, backup data has been compromised, so nothing is recoverable. Can we investigate? Can we know what's the blast radius of the attack? Because, of course, here there is a disruption in the business. So time matters. There is a sense of urgency here. So they really need, the victims really need to save time as much as they can and be as fast as they can to recover, right? But there are multiple steps to take. And the first one is to try and know what has been impacted, because if you don't know, well, you end up trying to recover more than data probably that you need, and you waste time, and you cannot afford to waste time. And if you waste too much time, and that's actually the last point here on the right, if you cannot recover too quickly enough, then you may end up deciding paying the ransom too, because you've lost already too much time. Now, the other thing, and actually I'm going to come back to this, victims must know if sensitive or confidential information has been touched. But I'll get back to that. And then, of course, the security ops need to do what they have to do. So do the forensics, investigate the root cause, the vulnerabilities that have been exploited and things like that, and try to contain the incident. So, at Rubric, we believe that security should be put at the point of data. So it's not only a matter of protecting the data, but also securing that backup data. Now, I was talking about the fact that ransomware is evolving and is constantly evolving. And again, there is another quote here from Palo Alto Networks again that say, so first of all, it's a fact. Ransomware is a lucrative business. It's the truth, and that attracts, talents in terms of cyber attackers or cyber criminals. But in terms of the evolution, what we tend to see more and more now are double extortion attacks. And that's a very different problem as compared to what a ransomware attack used to be. And so if you think about what happened, so like I said, 24 months ago, 2 years ago, before this, double extortion threats were not very popular. It was one cyber criminal group that was known to use that. Today, we're close to 20 groups of cyber criminals that use that almost systematically. In 2020, last year, we'll see what kind of statistics, what numbers 2021 brings. But last year, we have seen 1,200 cases of double extortion attacks in 63 different countries, mostly in the US and the UK. But still, now this is really becoming more and more popular. So it's not only about these countries, it's really almost everywhere. And it's actually become the first and the number one threat. So if we think about the anatomy of a ransomware attack today, so like I said before, it was always the same. Attackers get in by exploiting your vulnerability or by using some phishing techniques or things like that. Then the attack would remain silent for a few weeks or months, just the time for it to run a campaign, what they call a campaign, which is about trying to compromise the, for example, the directory or the identity management system, and get some credentials that have high privileges or high permissions, and then try to reach through the network what kind of machine and what kind of data is exposed and is reachable, so that once they have that sort of inventory, the day that it strikes, well, it's going to strike everything at the same time. And then after that, the next step would have been, and that was prior COVID, the next step would have been, well, let's try to compromise the backups, either by deleting it or by attacking the backup infrastructure or by encrypting the backup data or whatever it may be, and then attack the production data. Now, all of these steps still exist today, but before doing these, accessible data is exfiltrated, which means that there's a copy of the accessible data that is taken out of the perimeter of the company. And that means that in the remediation plan, that changes everything. So once we know this, what are the questions that we must ask ourselves to make sure that we come prepared? Because actually, unfortunately, I don't think that it's a matter of if it's going to happen, it's a matter of when. So there are 3 questions, basically. How can I make sure that my backups will be usable if anything, should anything bad happen? How can I make sure that my backups are not going to be compromised? That's the first thing. Second thing, if all of my different layers of security, which again, we're not here to replace, not at all. On the contrary, I think everyone should double down on these different layers of security. But still, if an attack gets through, how can I know what has been impacted? And so how can I know what I need exactly to recover? And then, last but not least, the data, we must suppose that the data has been exfiltrated, because it's almost all the time now that this kind of things happen. And amongst this data that has been exfiltrated, what kind of data has been exfiltrated? Like, did I have, if I'm a hospital, for example, do I have some patient and healthcare data that has been breached? Or do I have some partner data or customer data or personal identification information of my employees that have been breached? I need to know all of that, because actually, and that's why it changes everything. When an organization is victim of a cyber attack, they must report and notify some different types of authorities. Of course, it depends on the country and on the company, but there's always some sort of authority that the victim must report to. And when they do the notifications, they must know exactly what kind of data potentially has been exfiltrated. It's mandatory. It's by law. Now, to just cover the first point, which is how can we make sure that backups cannot be compromised? Just to level set everyone, a few key principles of data protection in general. So, of course, to make sure that we can secure the backup data, we're going to talk about air gapping and immutability and zero trust. But there are different ways of doing these kind of things. Of course, the first one is not doing it at all, not doing any air gap, not doing any immutability, not doing zero trust, not having that zero trust approach. Then there's, for the air gapping, a logical approach and a physical approach. I think that the best and the most obvious example of physical air gap is actually tape. But the problem with tape and with ransomware attacks is that, like I said, there's a sense of urgency. Time matters. The time to recover, the RTO basically matters a lot. But recovering or doing mass recoveries from tape may not bring what we expect, which is fast recoveries. And doing some logical air gapping has the advantages of doing air gap, but with something that is not exactly online. I mean, it's not physically disconnected, but it's not available anywhere outside of the backup system. It's not available in the network. It's not available through a standard protocol. It cannot be reached through the outside. And that's what we do. In terms of immutability, well, it's quite binary here. It's either you do or you provide some immutability features or not. Immutability means that the data cannot be harmed. It cannot be changed, edited, modified, deleted, encrypted, nothing at all. Once it's written, and it remains untouched. And then there's the zero trust. And zero trust means, instead of what we used to do in the past, which was trust and then verify, it's the other way around. Never trust, always verify. Always, always verify and authenticate. Always, always, always. Never assume trust anywhere. And that's what we do. So the middle line is what Rubric does. So when you think about air gapping with some, let's say, traditional data protection solutions on the marketplace, you're going to have some multiple different components. Some of them are going to be on different systems. Some of them are going to be on Windows. Just be aware that some types of ransomware attacks target specifically Windows machines. And so these can be vulnerable. And in terms of the, I would say the repositories or the target storage where the backup data is, well, it depends on the solution again. But if it can be exposed on the network one way or another, it is vulnerable too. So with Rubric, what we've done is that even though a cyber attack can or will try to reach everything that it can through the network, it won't be able to reach to Rubric and to get to the backup data. Again, it's immutable, but that's not the only thing that we provide to make sure that the solution is impenetrable. Actually, what we have is something that we call, it's not like a name of a product or whatever. It's just, we have that principle of bunker in a box, which means that really we've put everything in place to make sure that the solution is going to be impenetrable. So let's try to dive in a little bit. So first of all, of course, we've got immutability. Now, the thing is, I think everybody talks about immutability at the moment on the marketplace in the data protection space. And don't get me wrong, it's a very good thing. It's a very, very good thing. Now, of course, not all vendors do the exact same things, which also makes sense. And the way that we do it as Rubric is that we have an immutable file system. So that's a proprietary file system that we've built, which is called Atlas, and that was built from the ground up to be immutable. So what that means is that our immutability approach is native. It's by design, it's by default. It's not an option. It's not something that customers can turn on. No, it's all backups on Rubric are immutable. Like, I can really tell you that 100% of the backup data stored in Rubric across the globe, worldwide, everywhere, all customers, 100% are immutable. Second thing, we, like I said, zero trust. We never assume trust, we always verify. And as part of that zero trust approach, we only allow Rubric developed and signed code to be run on Rubric. No third-party apps whatsoever, no application catalog whatsoever, only Rubric developed and signed code. Of course, but just like I think everybody else, we've got end-to-end encryption, which is, I think it's quite basic, but it's important to have. And of course, we do that for everything, everywhere, whether it's in transit or at rest. Then comes the time to think about securing the access to the platform, because of course, if you don't do that, and if a cyber criminal or a ransomware attack gets the right credentials with the right permission, including on the backup system, well, I mean, anything is possible, right? Including compromising the entire system and the backup data. So logins must be secured too. So we've got multiple layers of securing all of these. Of course, we can, integrate with some SAML2 compliant solutions, both for SSO and multi-factor authentication. So that's pretty cool for customers that already have something in place. As long as it's compliant with SAML2, we will support that, and that will be configurable in Rubric to secure the access. Talked about MFA, and we recommend actually all of our customers to turn on MFA. And then of course there is RBAC, role-based access control, so that the backup admins can really control who is allowed to do what in the system, but also on what types of objects, so granularly. And that's quite important, especially in maybe multi-tenant environments where there's a master company and then subsidiaries. You can really control who can do what for what objects. And everything and everyone will need to be authenticated all the time. So that means that anybody that logs in to Rubric and does something, well, actually the admins will only be able to do what they can do according to the privileges that have been granted to them, and they will only need to authenticate. But that applies to automation as well. So Rubric is built on an API first architecture, so everything is automatable. But the thing is that when you use the APIs and when you call the Rubric APIs, every single API call must be authenticated. And actually, I will go further than that in the zero trust approach. Even within the Rubric architecture, so between the Rubric nodes that comprise the cluster, the nodes between themselves, when they communicate, and they have to communicate for different things, of course, they always need to authenticate between each other, always. And it's a bi-directional authentication. When one node needs to perform any operation at the file system level, whether it's to write a new backup, a new data, or to read from that to do a recovery or do different types of things, even the Rubric nodes must authenticate to the file system. Mandatory. Now, we've talked about the access, especially when you integrate the backup system into, for example, an Active Directory or another LDAP directory, for example. And so you manage the identities centrally with that sort of directory. That's cool. But don't forget that we're talking about ransomware attacks here. And probably one of the first things that will be attempted will be to compromise the directory. So it also means that we still need to think about the local logins on the platform and also to secure them. And so to secure them, of course, we still have RBAC and all of that, but we also have a built-in multi-factor authentication option that we recommend to turn on at least for the local user accounts. And it's a TOTP MFA. TTP stands for time-based one-time password that you can configure it extremely easily with the Microsoft Authenticator app or the Google Authenticator app on a smartphone, for example. So we not only secure the logins with the directory, but also the local logins, just to avoid any backdoors or things like that. Everything that you will set up around this will also apply not only to the logins to the system and the APIs, but also to SSH, should SSH be allowed. Then, and that's quite important, and I'm going to get back to immutability here, because I think, and we think as Rubric, that immutability is great, immutability is essential, which is also why I was saying that, it's great that everybody's talking about immutability now and pretty much all the vendors do something for immutability. It's really good. But immutability on its own is not enough. And what I mean by that is, if a login is compromised, let's assume that this can happen. And an admin account is compromised. And then you get into the system and, well, the existing backup data is immutable. So even an admin cannot delete or harm that backup data. Fine. But what if I can change the retention policies? I mean, if I change the retention policies and set them to the minimum, what is going to happen? Well, what is going to happen is that all the backup data that is older than the new setting, which is like the very minimum, maybe 1 day, something like that, is going to expire. And when the data expires, it is deleted. So that's another way of deleting backup data. So to avoid this, we have a retention lock mechanism, which is extremely important. And to me, immutability is only good if you've got some sort of retention lock that you can configure, just to avoid that kind of things. Now, the last piece, because it's not over, my friends, it's not over. The last piece is, again, we're talking about avoiding changing the retention policies, but think about it. Retention is depending on the time that goes by. But in IT systems, in software, on servers, the clock is usually synchronized with something else. And in an IT environment, usually it is synchronized with a trusted source of time with the NTP protocol, most of the time, right? But what if you could compromise that as well? If you can take control of that, you can make the backup environment think that the day of today is not the day of today, or the date of today, sorry. And you can jump in time, jump forward in time. And that's the principle of syncing the clock to apply corrections to have the clock in sync, and so have it jump back forwards or backwards. But the system allows that. So if you can trick that system, if you can trick the trusted source of time, then you can have the systems, including the backup systems, think that they need to synchronize and jump their clock forward. And if you do that, well, guess what? The backup data is going to age. And if it reaches the expiration policies, expiration settings, it's going to expire. And then it's going to be deleted. So we also must protect against that. And so we've built Ntp Protection as well. And we use what is called a monotonic clock, which doesn't sync time with a trusted source, but which counts the time from a given point in time, a given starting point in time that cannot be changed. And in that case, the time that passes by becomes absolute. And it's only when you combine all of these and you have all of these variables in the same equation that you can get that impenetrable solution. And that's what we built. Now, that was just for making sure that the backup data will be usable. Second step, we need to know what has been impacted. And we actually put the backup data at work, and we'll leverage the metadata thanks to machine learning and a deep neural network, so artificial intelligence, to detect encryption, to detect anomalous behavior, but again, from the backup data. So we're not talking about, having to deploy agents to do the analysis and do things like that. No, we've already got the production data because we've backed it up, right? So we use that backed up data and we put some data intelligence to it, thanks to ML and AI, and we are able to detect encryption. And it's actually real detection. I mean, it's just, yeah, we think that maybe, no. That's the first level. Yeah, we think that maybe this is suspicious. Then we do a second level, a deeper level of analysis, and we can really determine whether or not data has been encrypted. And then from there, we can alert, of course, but we can also give the full visibility over what has been impacted to the victim. So the victim knows exactly what data has been harmed so that they can make the right decisions and speed up the recovery process, either by doing maybe some surgical recoveries, only of the few maybe shares that have been impacted. If the blast radius of the attack is not too big, then fine. But sometimes, and in a lot of cases, actually, that's going to be a large portion of the environment that is going to be compromised. So in that case, it can also be utilized to do mass recoveries, whether it's by leveraging things such as live mounts, to speed up the RTO, or whether it's to do in-place recovery, which is something that I'm going to cover in a few. But there are multiple different options, and from that visibility, you can make the right decisions and speed up the recovery process. And the other step that needs to be considered and not overlooked, like I said, is also that we must suppose, because of double extortion threats, we must suppose that if production data has been impacted and now we can know what has been impacted, we must assume that the same data sets have been also exfiltrated. And like I said, there are some obligations for victims to report to some authorities that they have experienced a cyber attack, but they also must report potentially what kind of data, and I'm talking about sensitive and confidential information, have been breached. It's mandatory. Like I said, it's by law. And so victims that fail to do that, and we've got real world cases a lot. Victims that fails to do so will switch from being just the victim, which is a fact, and that can be proven quite easily, to being a victim and a culprit. And that really changes the way of thinking a remediation plan, because it's not only about, identifying the patient zero and what has been exploited and how the attack got in and what we need to recover and try to recover that. It's also about the legal context. But to be able to do that, you need to know exactly what data was in what has been harmed. And so that's what we provide too. That's built in. And with the same principles, we have the production data because it's backed up by Rubric. We index everything. So we've got the metadata, and we use that metadata to know exactly if within that data that has been breached, there were some hits of credit card numbers, of personal identification information, of Swedish passport numbers, of you name it. If you think about hospitals, patient files as well, these kind of things. So we've got some analyzers that can be utilized. We've got some built-in analyzers, and of course, customers can create their own custom analyzers. Then you put that into policies, you assign the policies to sets of data, and then all the analysis will be done automatically based on the backup data. So again, no agents whatsoever. So victims can know exactly amongst the data that has been impacted by the ransomware attack if they have this kind of sensitive or confidential information too. So they can do their notification and their reports the right way, and they can comply with the authorities. Before jumping in, maybe I can show you quickly a few things that I was talking about. So let's log into what we call Polaris, which is our SaaS platform. Did I click login? Maybe not. Oh, wrong password. Bear with me. That's the password manager that is not doing its job. Should be this one. Boom. Yeah, it's a little longer. So when logging in, actually I've set my user account to log into what we call the global dashboard. And when I get into that global dashboard, as soon as I get in or log in, I can see here the information about the anomalies or what has been detected. And I see that there are 12 anomalies here. And right from here, I can click investigate, right from the dashboard. And I know that I have a bunch of virtual machines that have some suspicious files here. And so I can get in, I can select one, for example. So I can see that I have 4.3 thousand files that are suspicious, same amount deleted, same amount added. That's really weird. I can get in, I can browse, but I also can get a summary here. I can see the activity of, what's suspicious, deleted, added. I can do the details here. And yes, then I can go to browse and I can see that apparently that was a Windows machine. And on the C drive, I have some suspicious data. I can go there. I can see that, oh, apparently there's a specific folder, which is a share that has been touched. And let's dive into this. And apparently all the data, all the subfolders have been attacked here. So I could go deeper and, go within this and see, for example, it says this one is suspicious because it was actually added and it has a weird extension, .encrypted. That's strange. So you can see all of that. Of course, you could do like surgical recovery if there's like only one share, for instance, or just a few files. If it's a bunch of files, you would actually select the ones that have been deleted. And then you can select everything and then select to recover and then decide how you want to recover. Do you want to export that, like download the data from the backups? Do you want to recover to the original location? Do you want to recover to the same VM, but to separate folder? You can choose. Do you want to export, which would be to recover to a virtual machine, but that is different from the original one. Or you could actually just go here, or maybe one level above, select the entire share, actually the one that apparently has been compromised, and try to recover all of that right from there, right from the same UI that gives the visibility, right? But like I said, maybe it's even worse than that. Like, of course, here it's a lab environment, but in a real world situation, maybe I would see, like, I don't know, hundreds of VMs that have been impacted. And if so, I could select multiple VMs. Let's do this. I'm not going to select all of them, but I could say, I want to select multiple VMs and I want to recover them and do a mass recovery. And what I'm going to do here, or what I would do here, would be, for example, from the latest backup available, or I can choose, you know, another recovery point. I can just go ahead and live mount all of these virtual machines directly from Rubric instead of recovering them, or I can export them. Or I can do some in-place recovery, but I'm going to come to that later. So I could do some, you know, mass recovery, or I could also trigger a disaster recovery. But let's cover this in a few minutes, and I'm conscious of time, so I need to make sure that I can cover everything that I want. Just another thing that I wanted to show you, it's about sensitive information discovery. If I go to Sonar here, same principle from the backup data, I can see if, you know, in the data that I want to analyze, because, you know, customers always decide what they want to analyze, if they have hits of different types of things. So if I go to management here, I can actually see my analyzers. So a given analyzer will try to identify some specific data format, like I said, a Swedish passport number. I think we have that. There we go. See, Swedish passport number, Swedish national ID, Swedish tax identification number. And actually, we are about to release a massive number of new analyzers specifically for Europe. But there's a lot of things. And of course, you can always create a custom one based on regular expressions or a dictionary, and then create your policies, given the fact that a policy is actually a set of analyzers. So you select multiple analyzers within one policy, then you would actually assign a given policy to maybe VMware virtual machines or data sets, and then everything is going to be discovered automatically, and you will be able to see, you know, if everything's normal or not. And especially you will be able to correlate you know, data that has been impacted and breached, and whether or not in that data or in these workloads, whether or not you had some PII or some, you know, national ID card numbers or things like that were there. So you can then of course export all of that. You can even see the details, and you can do the right reports and notifications. Just coming back here for a few slides before we reach the top of the session, but I think that then we have like 15 minutes for Q&A, which is good. So for the last 5 minutes, let's see what's actually new specifically for VMware. Everything that I've covered so far, the security approach, is absolutely applicable to VMware workloads, and I should even say specifically for VMware workload, even if it's not only. But now, if we think about data protection, let's just double click on what we've brought over the past few months for VMware workloads. So there's one thing that was, I think, a first in the data protection space, at least from a backup perspective, which is continuous data protection. Of course, it was not new in the industry, but usually CDP for virtual machines was mostly for VM replication and for disaster recovery scenarios. And so we've brought that for backup. So the idea here is, you know, with the regular way of backing up virtual machines, you would take point-in-time snapshots, actually, so using VMware snapshots, and point-in-time backups using these snapshots at a regular interval. And sometimes it's just not enough for critical systems. So if you think about, for example, databases, we and others can do much better than that. It can do point-in-time recovery because of another way of protecting at the application level, and we can have a more granular RPO and a much better RPO thanks to this. And we apply the same kind of principles of point-in-time recovery for databases to VMware virtual machines. And this is thanks to actually the VIO API, which is provided by VMware, so that we can have a much better RPO and lose a lot less data in case we need to recover. But again, that we haven't applied that to VM replication. We have applied that to VM backup. And that was for these very specific use cases where you have critical virtual machines that are not databases, for example, that you still need very short RPOs for. Well, you can do this with the Rubric CDP. So the way that it works, like I said, is that we utilize the VIO API, and so there's a filter to deploy on each ESXi host. That's the way that it works with the API. And thanks to that VIO filter, we actually capture the IOs that are replayed on Rubric, and that can even be replicated with Rubric, by the way. Then you can set that up in a Rubric SLA domain, which is our policies. You just have to turn on CDP once it's configured and set the window during which you want to keep the logs that will be utilized to replay the virtual machine. And we can set that up to 24 hours. Second thing that we've brought recently this year is the support of Vsphere storage cluster. So what we used to call stretch clusters. And the idea here in terms of the architecture, so we have two sides, a single vCenter, it's an active-active environment, or it can be an active-active environment. So we would actually replicate the architecture at the Rubric level. So we would have one cluster on site A, one cluster on site B, and we would also replicate the Rubric backup data bidirectionally. That's for the architecture. And in terms of how it works, actually we've brought that for awareness of where the active VM is, so that first of all, Rubric will utilize the right cluster to protect the right virtual machines on the same site. That's the first thing. And in case of failover and or a failback, so that Rubric also switches to the right cluster automatically and still continuing to do forever incremental backups. So it's not because there is a failover, so we're on the other side, that we need to take a new full backup. No, we just continue the chain automatically. So that's of course pretty neat. The other thing, which is more or less related, it's not necessarily related, but in some very large environments, you don't want any clusters to see all of the vSphere environment. And so we can now determine for a given Rubric cluster which hosts or hosts groups can be visible in the Rubric UI, just to make sure that if there is some different teams that manage the different sites, for example, well, they only see what they are supposed to see. In terms of the recovery options for VMware virtual machines, we have a bunch of options. Export being, just a VM recovery. I was going to say a classic VM recovery process, but it's just that we're not recovering to the original location with export. We are recovering a new virtual machine object with new parameters. With live mount, well, we just publish the selected image of the virtual machine from the backup from Rubric to a given ESXi host, for instance. And then it can be storage vMotion, for example. And then we've got instant recovery, which is quite similar, although with instant recovery, it's really the recovery operation. And in that case, the original VM is deprecated, and the one that is instantly recovered takes its place. And we are introducing a new recovery option for VMware Workloads specifically, which is in place recovery, which is, just to put it simple, a CBT restore, or change block tracking restore, so that we can only recover the blocks that are different between the backup and the production version that we have. So it preserves everything, of course, the UUID, the managed object reference, for instance. Live mount is great for RTO, but if you think about recovering a bunch of virtual machines, if you do it with live mount, you will always have to storage vMotion them. And so if you really want to save some time in IOs on your storage, it's a good idea to consider in-place recovery, because you won't have that storage vMotion. It's going to be longer in terms of our RTO than live mount, of course, but it's going to be much quicker than a regular recovery or an export. And last but not least, we've introduced AppFlows, which is our disaster recovery orchestrator. I'm going fast here because I'm conscious of time again. But the idea is that AppFlows will be able to manage Rubric replication and will be able to orchestrate a failover or to test failover in an isolated environment, to manage failback as well. For now, we only support VMware to VMware on-premises. We also support VMware on-prem to VMC, so VMware Cloud on AWS. We will soon add support for disaster recovery to AVS, which is actually the last session for today, and to Google Cloud VMware Engine 2. So the idea is that you build blueprints. Blueprints are actually a concept of recreating dependencies. So when you have multi-tiered applications, you set the virtual machines with different roles that compose the application in the same blueprint. And then you give, the priorities and where it should fail over and things like that. That's a blueprint. It's not a disaster recovery plan. It's virtually what the application looks like. And that's the beauty of it. And I really wanted to finish with this. AppFlows is also integrated with the rest. So it's also integrated with Radar and Sonar. And for example, if Radar that I showed earlier detects an anomaly, customers will of course be able to see granularly what has been impacted, like I showed you, but they will also be able to select blueprints directly from the Radar interface and to multiple select blueprints and to fail over them or to recover them directly, because that's also something that I haven't mentioned yet. But with AppFlows, it's not only about disaster recovery to another site. Of course, we can orchestrate that, but it's also the capability to orchestrate mass recovery on the same site. So disaster recovery is an option, definitely, but we can also, with AppFlows, orchestrate a mass recovery following a ransomware attack on the same site. So it doesn't necessarily need to be a disaster recovery scenario. And that's it, because actually it's 2:04, so I'm 4 minutes over, but I guess we're gonna have some questions maybe.
Yeah, so there is a question from Alex here, Pierre. I think you partly addressed this, but still, I think the question is still valid.
Yeah, so the question is there any multi-site solution available from Rubric for multi-region or stretch cluster environment? So yeah, that's actually a good question, because there are two questions here, I think. So stretch cluster, yes, we just covered that. So we do support Vsphere Metro Storage Cluster with what I described. And the other thing is, with Polaris that I showed a little earlier here, so that interface, if I go back to GPS or to the global dashboard, but I'm going to go to GPS, our SaaS platform is really the one to control everything. And so you see that we've got everything here to detect the encryption and the anomalies and the sensitive information, and also to manage and orchestrate disaster recovery, because AppFlows is also in that same interface. But it's also a centralized management console. So as you can see here, well, I don't have much on that, but as you can see here, there's a map of the world, and you will be able to locate all of the Rubric clusters across the globe and then manage them from that central location. So that's definitely multi-region. Yes, absolutely.
And is there a possibility to replicate between those devices?
Between the Rubric clusters, yes. Oh. And actually the stretch cluster support is really based on that. So the idea is to have one cluster per site, Rubric cluster per site, and to replicate the data in both directions.
All right. Great. So please feel free to ask if you have any other question in a Q&A section.
Absolutely.
We still have some time.
And in the meantime, that's actually the app flows in the face, which is also, like I said, in Polaris, where customers can define their blueprints. And actually, when you create a blueprint, let's quickly do that. There's just a few steps. Let's call it VMUG. You can choose the source cluster. You can choose this one. Choose whether or not you want to do remote failover. So remote failover would be the classic disaster recovery scenario. If you do not enable that, the blueprint is going to be for recovery on the same site, like I explained. So let's do this. And here you will search or select for or filter out for your virtual machines that you want to put in the blueprint. Again, these are supposed to be the virtual machines that host the different components of a given application. You recreate the dependencies of a given app with a blueprint. So you would select, let's say I take these two, select the virtual machines. And then I only have two here, so no, it's not very interesting, but let's say I have 5, you would select the priorities. So who is going to start first? Because of course, if we're talking about dependencies, it also means that some services must be up before some others. And that's what you define here. So let's say that I'm doing this, like I have the backend and then I have the app, for example. So the database and the app. If you need to have some sort of reconfiguration for, I don't know, because it's a different environment, it's a different networking environment. I don't know, you need to change anything. You can use post scripts to execute for the different virtual machines. Now I don't have anything here, and then you create the blueprint. And once you have your blueprints, you can select one or multiple, and you can, let's just select one for now. Not this one, not a good example, apparently. This one. You can test failover, and if you do that, actually you will be able to select different networking environments, and actually you can map the resources. Like if you create a blueprint that is for remote failover, so disaster recovery scenario, you will be able to map the resources. So like on which data store is this going to be rehydrated? On which port group, which VM networking do you want these virtual machines to be connected? Do you want them to be even connected to the network or not? So you're going to do that. And of course, there will be different networking parameters, whether you choose to do a test failover or an actual failover. And you can also like select multiple blueprints, actually the ones that have been configured for same site recovery, so not remote failover, and select in place recovery. And in that case, you will trigger a mass recovery of multiple blueprints and all the VMs that comprise these, but doing a change block tracking recovery, which is orchestrated.
Great stuff. We still don't have any other question. If you don't mind, I just gonna ask you a question because sometimes I just get this because, you know, I'm working with a lot of customers throughout Sweden and Nordics. So one thing that I imagine that could be one of the questions, if the customers are using some form of traditional disaster recovery backup solutions, and they see the need to transit to a newer, modern data protection solution like Rubric.
Mm-hmm.
What would you say is the first steps? What are the first steps? Where and how they should start?
So you mean to switch to a new solution?
Exactly. Yeah.
That's a classic. The thing is, and it's not about Rubrik or any other vendor. It's just the way that it is. You know, we all have our ways of doing things, and we have our own backup formats and all of that. So there's no real I was going to say, migration path from one solution to another one. So the idea would be to plan for the switch, which again is going to be a switch and not a migration. And what I mean by that is that something, and that's usually what we see, is that, you know, it's not because the customer decides to switch to another solution and they purchase it, that all of a sudden when they have the licenses, everything is going to be switched. No, it's not like that, unfortunately. It takes some time, and it's the time to migrate the different workloads to the new solution, because of course you cannot afford to completely remove the previous one for maybe compliance reasons to different types of regulations or even internal regulations. And you need to keep, I don't know, X months or X years of backup data. So, you know, it's very common to see multiple different solutions, even just for the time that it's going to take to switch from one to another one. So my advice here would be just to think about this ahead and to plan for it, and to make sure that in the previous solutions, the retentions that were set were the right ones. And what I mean by that is really the ones that fit the needs and not the ones that fit anybody's wishes, which is something very different. But actually that's, you know, I think it's a fair advice too, in the sense that that's also something that GDPR says.
Yep, exactly.
You must set the right retentions and not the ones that you would like to have. And that counts when you want to switch to a new solution.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, we have a same experience with a lot of customers that we just helped to switch to newer solutions.
Yeah.